Welcome to this Bach Network session at the 2023 Leipzig Bachfest. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we will be discussing the future of Bach sources. Let's start by introducing ourselves.
My name is Manuel Bärwald. I'm a professor of library and information science at the Leipzig University of Applied Sciences. Before that, I was for 15 years in the research department of the Bach Archive, and my scientific work includes editions of the work of J.S. Bach and research in the field of scientific communication systems in the early modern period, and well, everything that has to do with music libraries and their collection activities.
My name is Andrew Frampton. I'm a lecturer in music at the University of Oxford, and I'm also a member of the Bach Network Council. My research interests include the creation and transmission of manuscript sources by J.S. Bach and his circle, particularly the music of Zelenka, music bibliography, textual criticism, and material culture.
And my name is Ruth Tatlow, and I'm chair of the Bach Network Council. I'm currently a visiting fellow at Clare Hall, Cambridge, where I'm writing a book on Bach's liturgical cantatas. My research interests include the history of ideas and compositional procedures in Bach's time.
Hello, I'm Bettina Varwig. I'm a professor of music history at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Emmanuel College, and my research interests include the music of J.S. Bach, Heinrich Schütz, musical listening, the history of the emotions, histories of the body, and so on.
Although the study of Bach sources has a long and illustrious history, exciting new discoveries and research methods continue to reshape our ideas about Bach, his music, and his world. The future of Bach sources is therefore a topic that still fundamentally influences the work of everyone studying and engaging with Bach's music. We will each give a 5-minute presentation about our research, and after some discussion between us, we'll open up to questions from the audience. So without further ado, let's begin with Manuel.
Thank you, Andrew. For it is clear that a Bach manuscript means something quite different to us today than it did to people 300 years ago. I believe at the beginning of our discussion, it is worth taking a look on the value music manuscripts had in the past. For many centuries, music manuscripts had above all a very practical value. Since the printing of sheet music was much more complicated than the printing of books, the handwritten reproduction of sheet music retained its equal importance alongside music printing until the 19th century. Initially, therefore, the handwritten sources of Bach's works had primarily a practical relevance for performance. In Bach's case, both aspects are combined in collections such as, for example, the Altbachische Archiv. Bach conscientiously preserved the musical heritage of his ancestors, but at the same time, the sources were for him the basis for a practical engagement with the compositions they contain. The historicism in the 19th century not only brought the so-called rediscovery of Bach, but also led to a cult of personality that continues in ever new facets until today. The value attached to the original manuscripts of outstanding composers developed into relic-like veneration of the documents and led to such absurd results as the mutilation of the score of Cantata 188. Individual pages were cut into stripes, and presumably in order to be able to provide an increasing circle of Bach admirers with relics of their master. In the course of Bach research, which had been developing since the middle of the 19th century, the documentary value of the culturally and historically important sources came more and more to the fore. A highlight of Bach research was the development of the new chronology of the vocal works in the 1950s. By diplomatic evaluation of the sources, so evaluating the watermarks of the papers and detailed scribal research, groundbreaking conclusions were made. New findings of comparable scope not yet been achieved in the course of digital work with Bach's sources. The focus of digitization to date has been primarily on the location-independent digital provision of the globally scattered sources, and thus makes a major contribution to the sustainable preservation of source content and to the provision of scholarly supervised high-quality object and content metadata. The basic tasks of libraries and documentation centers are to collect, to catalog, to preserve, and to make available relevant materials. I have already mentioned cataloging work, metadata, and providing digital access to source material. So finally, let us look just briefly at the aspect of collecting. Collecting Bach sources is becoming increasingly costly for public institutions in an ever-shrinking market of original manuscripts and rising prices. Collection strategies help to objectify the relevance of source materials for one's own collection and to act transparently when acquiring rare and unique holdings, especially when we will design them on an inter-institutional basis. In 2015, the autograph of the B minor Mass was added to the International Register of UNESCO's Memory of the World program. As important this distinction is for Bach's oeuvre, basically, I think, unfortunately, it does a disservice to an urgently needed future understanding of the internationally scattered Bach manuscripts as a coherent and interrelated body of source material. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I wonder if I could ask a quick follow-up question. I'm interested in how you think these collection strategies that you talked about contribute to an understanding of this globally scattered body of manuscript as a sort of unified corpus of sources.
Well, on the one hand, not all libraries have yet developed a collection strategy for their unique holdings. However, the real task for collection development of national important source holdings will be to develop some kind of overarching collection strategy, so not focused only on several institutions. So we have that in Germany for all kinds of printed material from the 15th century on until today, but we don't have that for manuscript material, and I think it is worth thinking about such a strategy.
Thank you. No, that's fascinating prospects. I think we'll move on and hear from Andrew now.
Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach said of his father that, quote, in his last years he esteemed highly Fuchs, Caldara, Handel, Kaiser, Husse, both Grounds, Telemann, Zelenka, Bender, and in general everything that was worthy of esteem in Berlin and Dresden. Except for the first four, he knew the rest personally. And today, new research into the source materials of some of these sometimes marginalized 18th century composers is significantly reshaping our understanding of the complex musical networks of which J.S. Bach was a part. Of the composers C.P. Bach named, I'm particularly interested in Bach's relationship with the Dresden court composer Jan Dismas Zelenka and how they exchanged sources of Catholic music. And I want to talk about just one example that my colleague Jan Stockigt and I have been working on. As is well known, Bach's Mass in B minor makes extensive use of parody, that is, the reworking of pre-existing music and setting it to a new text. Two of its movements, the Gratias Agimus Tibi and the Dona Nobis Pacem, reuse Stile Antico music found in the 1731 Leipzig Town Council inauguration cantata Wir danken dir Gott, wir danken dir, BWV 29. Now, as Peter Vorney has mentioned in his 2017 article, there's an extraordinary resemblance between the nature and treatment of the main subject used here by Bach and that of a 16-bar movement in a mass setting by the Italian Viennese imperial court composer Antonio Caldara. This is the Glorificamus Te from Caldara's Missa Providentiae in D minor, which dates from around 1720. Now, we can be certain that Bach knew the Missa Providentiae because it's the same work from which, in the late 1730s or early 1740s, he copied out a Sanctus setting which was once thought to be authentic. But how could Bach, who, as Carl Philipp Emanuel informs us, did not know Caldara or Fuchs and had no connections to the Viennese court, have accessed it? Of particular interest here is a copy of the Missa Providentiae found in Dresden that was owned by Zelenka, and it's in the hand of one of his copyists known as ZS0. This manuscript is especially remarkable because it contains a number of changes from the original version of the work. It also shows that Zelenka expanded Caldara's work from a Kyrie Gloria Mass into a complete setting using a technique called stretching that was common in Dresden at the time, whereby already existing movements were parodied to supply music for the additional text, although in this case the credo is an original composition by Zelenka himself. So Zelenka, who spent 3 years in Vienna studying with Fuchs, would have certainly known Caldara personally, and indeed his own catalogue of his personal music library shows that he possessed manuscript copies of 7 masses by Caldara. Here you can see the entry for the Missa Providentiae, and that most of these were acquired around 1727. It's been suggested on textual grounds that Zelenka accessed the Missa Providentiae via the music collection of the Prague Knights of the Cross with the Red Star. However, Caldara's music was widely circulated across Catholic Europe at the time, including in Bohemia, and there are a number of important Czech collections connected to Zelenka's circle about which almost nothing is known. So there's really not enough evidence, I don't think, currently available to securely ascertain the source used for Zelenka's copy. Now, as Peter Volney says, quote, whether this is a deliberate takeover needs further consideration, unquote. And that's especially given that we now think that the version in Cantata 29 was probably not the original parody model. But there are good reasons to suppose that the music existed with the same text before 1731. So it's striking to consider that Bach perhaps chose a Stile Antico theme resembling one by a well-known Catholic composer, not just for any occasion, but for the Leipzig Town Council inauguration, at which representatives from the Dresden court might have been present. And if indeed Cantata 29 is not the original model, and the music therefore predates 1731, it would be contemporaneous with Zelenka's stretching of the Missa Providentiae. This supports an increasing body of evidence to suggest that Bach made a stronger connection with Zelenka and Catholic music at the Dresden court in the late 1720s than previously thought. If indeed the fugue subject of the Gratias was loosely parodied from Caldara, it vividly shows us how Bach took a musical idea and led it across confessional borders, from its Catholic origins to a Lutheran cantata and back to a setting of the Catholic Mass, which of course was originally written for the Dresden court in 1733. And it's the sources themselves that show us how this network likely operated, as the text of Caldara's Mass crossed geographic and political borders from Vienna and Bohemia to Saxony via Zelenka, who showed it to Bach. Moreover, in no way does it diminish the originality and significance of Bach's composition, but rather makes it all the more astounding. This is just one example that shows how much we might still learn about Bach and his musical networks from carefully studying the sources of his contemporaries, especially to those whom, to quote C.P. Bach, he esteemed highly. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So one quick question. You mentioned that there is an increasing body of evidence to suggest that Bach made a strong connection to with Zelenka in Dresden in the late 1720s. What is some of the other evidence for that?
Yeah, so I can give another example which my colleague Jan Stockigt has been working on, which is that you might all know the cantata Jazz Gott in allen Landen, BWV 51, which we know was probably performed on the 15th Sunday after Trinity in 1730, but we don't know whether that was actually its first performance and the first occasion for which it was written. And it's also written in a very unusual style. It uses sort of the Dresden galant style. It's quite remarkable. And interestingly, there is a psalm setting by Zelenka called Laudate Pueri that dates from 1729 that uses almost exactly the same scoring. Trumpet obbligato, trumpet in the first and last movements. I think it's for tenor instead of soprano, but otherwise it's very, very similar. So it's tempting to kind of think that perhaps Bach might have seen that setting and that there's some relationship between the two works.
Thank you, Andrew. So now let's hear from Ruth.
So I chose my title, Handling Unruly Sources. Databases and digitized sources are changing the way we research and encouraging new and different questions. Scholars will always need to begin a research topic by reading what has already been written. With online resources, it's far easier nowadays to check the citation in articles and books and weigh up the arguments. This new ease of access is already causing many established narratives within the core knowledge of Bach's life and works to be questioned. Now, my focus is mostly on 17th and 18th century printed materials that Bach and his contemporaries could have read. Here's an example of how the availability of digitized books is giving rise to a new narrative for Cantata 196. We don't know when, where, or why Bach composed it. It may be his earliest cantata. The text here on the screen is the blessing from Psalm 115, verses 12 to 15. These sentiments are suitable for many different occasions, but the words, "May the Lord cause you to flourish, both you and your children," suggested to some scholars that it was for a wedding. Many have since doubted this, but nonetheless the wedding idea is still registered in Bach Digital in the BWV catalogue and written in books, liner notes and internet sites as if it were fact. In my survey of German devotional books, I have not yet come across this text used for a wedding, but I have discovered a shortened version printed in the popular prayer book by Johann Olearius to be used at the end of public worship, and an exact version of the cantata text in a 1702 collection of spiritual writings by Pastor Meyer, used as the introductory words to celebrate the new Hamburg Town Council. My next example shows how databases can release new areas of knowledge and how research questions can be brought to a conclusion more quickly and efficiently than ever before. It also illustrates the role of serendipity or chance in research. That is, the importance of stumbling across an idea, meeting the right person, and making unexpected connections, because we're human with complex creative brains. So I needed to know if Bach thought that Jesus died at the age of 33. I bumped into a senior New Testament scholar who didn't know the answer, but he was intrigued by the question. He put the word 33 through his database of early writings by early Greek church fathers. And the earliest hit was a lecture by Cyril of Jerusalem from the year 350. I then searched for Cyril in the database of 18th century German published sources and discovered that Salomon Deiling, Bach's Leipzig pastor, examined a 4-part thesis on this same Cyril in 1726. Now this was close, very close to Bach, but not close enough. So the next thing I did was ask Robin Lever, and he thought there might be a clue in the travel book in Bach's library, and he was right. I found there the proof I was looking for. Bach and his contemporaries definitely thought that Jesus died at the age of 33. My final example illustrates how databases promise more than they can deliver. I'm working on Cantata 82, Ich habe genug, a cantata for solo voice composed for 2nd of February 1727. A week later, Bach composed another solo cantata. Why were the choir boys not singing? We know there was no flu epidemic that year, so I just wondered, thinking around this issue, if I could find a weather report for that month. So I put the terms Dresden, Januar 1727 into the database. It was a wild card search, and I use a lot of those. The first hit was a printed biography of the world-famous Leipzig mathematician and engineer Jakob Leupold, who died on the 12th of January 1727. And for some reason, because this is what I do, I decided to read it. The biography told me that Georg Bose of the Bose House and Pastor Christian Weiss of Thomaskirche were close friends of Leupold, and that Leupold was buried with great pomp in Paulinerkirche. Most strikingly, though, it ends with the words, Ich habe alles genug. And this is weeks before the performance of the cantata I'm looking at. The social overlaps, the dates, and these words are too many to ignore, but Leupold does not appear in the database of German Leichenpredigt or funeral sermons. And I do not have a title for his funeral publications. I need to generate other ways creatively of finding the answer, and I would gratefully receive any ideas you have. And so, in conclusion, the increasing ease of access to rare books and manuscripts is going to challenge many established narratives and enrich, diversify, and renew the understanding of Bach's life and his compositions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ruth. That was really interesting, and I particularly like what you had to say about serendipity. I think that's really important, particularly in this age of when we've got so many things digitized, and it's sort of, this idea that, well, it's all out there and, someone's seen it and we just need to access it. Actually knowing what you're looking for and then just stumbling upon something, is still incredibly important, just as it is in a physical archive. But perhaps in the absence of serendipity, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that sort of you need to generate other ideas about that last cantata. What's the starting point for generating other ideas? How might you go about that?
Well, in the absence of the title of the Leichenpredigt, well, for a start, the starting point is he was buried with pomp and splendor, just as Archimedes was. He was called the Leipzig Archimedes. So he was a grand figure. We know Paulinerkirche had big ceremonies, so I am sure, 100% sure, that there was a Leichenpredigt and there was grand music. And in the Leichenpredigt, it probably will, in that publication, there probably will be a mention of what music was done. Where will I look? Well, I have to, until I've got the title of the funeral sermon, I have to look very much more imaginatively. So who was collecting the Leichenpredigt? They are collector's objects. We know that Bose was a friend and a sponsor. Was there a Bose Nachlass? Well, Bose died, and somebody in his family remarried a Richter, Johann Zacharias, and there is a Richter Nachlass with all these mechanics and engineering books. So I'm going to start looking in mechanical engineering museums, online. There is, we have to cast our net wide. I will find it.
It's a Bach scholarship, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that's where I'm starting, but I am also telling people about it and hoping that they might just know a relative of Leupold who kept one.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Great, okay. And finally now, let's hear from Bettina.
For any Bach scholar worth their salt, this title will immediately evoke that venerable tradition of research into Bach's handwriting that Manuel was referring to, grounded in the work of Georg von Daders and Alfred Dürr, which has produced such valuable insights into Bach's autographs, his scribes, watermarks, chronology, and so on. And recent technological advances have helped to push the field yet further, so the X-ray fluorescence method being used to distinguish between different ink types, and then a reference I came across by Yoshitaka Kobayashi suggesting that measuring the angle at which the writer's quill was held in different manuscripts could help with scribe identification. I haven't been able to find anything else about how that is enabled technologically, but it's a prospect out there. But of course, when Bach's hands didn't hold a quill, they were busy doing other things, musical things, holding a bow and a stringed instrument, touching the keys of a keyboard. And it is those activities of Bach's hands that I have recently been attending to more closely, and I've come to conclude that Bach's hands and his bodily resources more generally were vital agents in his processes of musical invention. So from such an embodied perspective, the musical notation that his hands produced can be read as a somatic script that inscribes and affords certain patterns of bodily engagement. So to give one very brief example, opening of the Invention in D minor. So the notation affords an initial smooth movement of the hand up the keyboard. And in Bach's time, possibly that would have been played with a sort of paired fingering 2-3, 2-3, rather than the thumb under, which was only sort of gradually coming into common practice at the time. However, it was executed in bar 2. That smooth motion is arrested, and so this disruptive downward leap of a diminished seventh lands on a black key, C sharp. And so this would either have required an unusually exposed use of the thumb on that black key, or an uncomfortable stretching of the hand to reach it with the second finger. And then the hand needs to shift back immediately to the B flat after that. So Bach's musical invention here is not just an abstract shape on the page, but it affords a sense of physical disjunction with audible implications for phrasing, articulation, and so on. And so the physically unsettling nature of that C sharp, I think, chimes quite nicely with the visual displacement of that note in the autograph here. So this with the stem pointing in the opposite direction from the surrounding notes. And then the physicality of this opening motive in turn turns out to shape at least some of the piece's larger scale musical features as we go through as well. I am aware that such an embodied approach to Bach's musical notation in many ways runs counter to established wisdom. So Robert Marshall wrote in his 1972 book on Bach's compositional process that creation is done only in the mind, and something of that creation is then stenographically recorded by the hand on paper under the direction of reason. But this craniocentric view of human creativity is being rapidly superseded in current embodied cognition research, for instance. And through that research, hands come into focus as key to rereading the notated sources of Bach's keyboard music, not as abstract representations of musical works, but as enfolding the flesh and blood and hands and bodily resources of its creator and the performers who might have reached for a copy of this. And so interestingly, research of this kind, in a certain way, unexpectedly comes to meet those technologically enhanced approaches to scribal hands, holding quills at different angles and so on. They converge in their interest in what hands are doing. So I want to leave you today with a question, which is, what might happen when traditional source study and embodied cognition research shake hands? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Bettina. I'm allowed to ask you a question. Do you know which question I'd like to ask you?
You're going to throw it right back at me.
I'm going to throw it straight back at you. Could you read it again? It was very well formulated.
What might happen when traditional source study and embodied cognition research shake hands? Boom, and the world is going to end. For me, the prospect of linking up fields of knowledge and fields of research and ways of approaching things that have traditionally been kept quite separate is really exciting. So there is a sense in which this is not a zero-sum kind of game where one type of research sort of eliminates or critiques the other, or critiques but in a productive way. So there's a way in which the kinds of insights produced through more traditional philological study then feed into an understanding of how looking at this notation with from an embodied perspective might give us a combined deeper insight into how these compositional processes worked, what that meant for performance, and where to find the hands in there, both in terms of a tool for making that notation work, but also as an agent in the creative and performing processes. So it's about synergies and allowing a genuine dialogue between these different approaches to let genuinely new insights emerge.
Well, we've covered quite a lot of material between the four of us, I think.
Thank you very much for listening so carefully, and thank you very much to the panelists. And I will also say thank you very much to the audience, for whoever's watching online or reading what we've done. We also can say don't forget to watch our website, where you'll find more information about Bach Network's publications. And please join us again. And from all of us here in Leipzig, goodbye.